What should and should not be on your mix bus when sending the mix for mastering. So the general rule of thumb here is do not, or try not to, limit the dynamics too much. A G-Bus comp style compression, perfectly fine. If you want to use it to just control the mix, glue that mix together before mastering, perfectly fine. We will do that on our end if required, but there's no harm in you doing that. Where the harm comes from is you doing things that are non-reversible. We can't reverse what it is that you've done, or we can, but it's going to have a negative impact, such as things like any hard limiting. If you're limiting the dynamic range too much, you know, the issue you've got there is we then run into the mastering chain with a limited dynamic range, whereas we need to be limiting at the right point in the chain, and that right point is at the end of the chain. Now sometimes we will limit on the way out if it's required. Sometimes you'll have a snare drum that's peaking way too much, and it doesn't require to be peaking like that, so we will hit something like the Better Maker, which has the clipper, or we'll use something in the box to clip that snare, for instance. And just, it's not a case of getting the whole mix and squashing it down and cutting everything off. It's a case of there's a tiny peak, you know, on a snare drum that's way too much. It's really popping out the mix. Just shaving that off so that we run into that master chain perfectly. Now, you can, by all means, you can add whatever you want if it's part of your sound. Just always bear in mind that you're printing and you're consolidating that sound into that mix. So things like saturation, yes, you can add saturation if you want, if it's part of your sound and you want to kind of create this sound that is your mix. Saturation is obviously going to be applied on our end, but there's no harm in you really doing this if you do it right. Obviously, if you bake the saturation into the mix, it's kind of undoable. We can't then remove that saturation. So it's always best left for us to do when mastering, but there's no harm in you doing it if it's done right and it's really part of your sound. Same with things like EQ. EQ is perfectly fine if you're doing the EQ right. If you're for instance increasing the highs so that now you've got a really unbalanced mix where you're really high with little to no bass, and you've tilted the mix like that, that's obviously wrong. But if it's a case of enhancing just some highs and just bringing out something, because you're doing it across a mix bus now, you're for instance adding the body into the mix, things like that, there's no harm in doing this, again, if it's done right. Compression, you know, it's ideal that you don't apply compression, because obviously we are obviously going to be applying compression, so it is best to leave compression off. But I understand that some people do want to control the mix, and often we do get this, that people are mixing into a compressor, they're mixing into a limiter, and then the problem they've got is when they take the compressor or the limiter off, the whole mix falls apart. So I understand some people when they say, you know, I need to have that compressor on, or I need to have that limiter on because it's part of my sound and I'm mixing into it. The one, if that is the case, the one thing that I would kind of recommend is just try not to use the limiting aspect of it. Try not to use that limiter, or if you do have to use that limiter and you really want to use the limiter, a lot of people say to me, you know, I want to put the limiter on just to catch the peaks. If it's just a case of catching the peaks, yeah, it's not too bad, because you're just taming certain peaks. It's not like you're smashing the whole mix. When you basically smash the whole mix through a limiter and you're really limiting everything, it has a very negative impact on what we can do when mastering. So yeah, saturation is perfectly fine, EQ perfectly fine, compression perfectly fine, limiting best to always leave off. Again, I can't stress this enough. It all comes down to whether what you're actually doing is right for the song. We obviously will be doing all of that, all of what I just said, saturation, EQ, compression, limiting, all of that is taken care of using analog equipment. So it's kind of, I often say to people, look, you can apply that, but just bear in mind that we will be applying it with real high-end equipment that is going to be better. So if you've sent, for instance, a really harsh mix because you've put a lot of gain in the high end using an EQ, we can't use, for instance, the Buzz EQ to its full effect to really enhance that. We can't use Silk Red on the MBT to enhance that because it's already been enhanced digitally. So there's a sweeter sound that we can achieve using certain pieces of equipment. So it's often best when it comes to a mix in regards to EQ is just have a nice, lovely, balanced mix. It doesn't need to be overly bright. It doesn't need to sound like your reference master. It's perfectly fine. Now, going on that point, what a lot of people do is when they're referencing their mix to a song they like, for instance, they're comparing it to a reference master. Now, what the reference master is obviously mastered, so you're not taking into account of the mastering chain. So all of what you're doing is you're trying to master the mix, and then trying to master, we're then going to master on top of your master to get, you're trying to recreate how this mix, this master sounds, when you should be, in an ideal world, you would have the mix version, not the master version as a reference. This is why I use my own reference mixes, because I have the original mixes for these rather than referencing a mix to a master, which we all know sounds totally different to the original mix. The mix sounds dull in comparison. It sounds dull and uncontrolled in comparison to the master, which is lovely, bright, wide, full of color and controlled. So yeah, I would say in an ideal world, don't apply anything. Let us apply everything, because we can do it accurately and we can do it with better equipment. But if you have to, no harm in adding saturation if done right. No harm in adding EQ if done right. No harm in adding compression if done right. Limiter, try not to apply one. But if you have to, you know, subtle. Keep it subtle when it comes to limiting.